We are in the book of Hebrews. We are at the end of chapter 6. But before we get into the text, just want to do a few more things of the uniqueness of the book of Hebrews. And there are names and designations for Christ that are found in Hebrews. Some you're not going to find anywhere else. They are specifically found in Hebrews. And we'll just go over these. In chapter 2, verse 10, you have the captain of their salvation. Chapter 3 and verse 1, he's called an apostle. Also in the same verse, he's called the high priest of our confession. And Christ is mentioned as high priest 11 times in the book of Hebrews. And that's one of those unique things found in Hebrews, such as that Melchizedek isn't mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. As we have discussed, he's mentioned in Genesis chapter 14. Nothing, and only once. Just that encounter. We're going to need to read that this morning. Then we have the promise. The Lord has sworn, Jehovah has sworn, and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That is Psalm 110 verse 4. Then there's nothing said about him until we get to the book of Hebrews. And then nothing said about him from there on out, making the book of Hebrews very unique in that respect. Very unique. And now, in chapter 5, verse 9, he's called the author of eternal salvation. Chapter 12, verse 2, he's the author and finisher of our faith. In chapter 13, verse 20, he is called the great shepherd of the sheep. Of course, that one is being called the good shepherd, or just a shepherd. The shepherd is nothing new, but that is a designation given to Christ in the book of Hebrews. Now, where we ended last week was in chapter 6, verse 19, but I want to make mention concerning the promise given to Abraham. And beginning in verse 13, there is a promise and an oath that is made by God. And these are called immutable, which means unchangeable, unalterable. They are sure that you have a promise, and a promise from God is already sure. But here you have an oath that is there as well. And he swears by himself that for men indeed swear by the greater, and oath is for confirmation. Oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. All right, verse 13, he could swear by no one greater. He swore by himself. All right, here is this promise and this oath that is to Abraham, and it is blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply you. I'll multiply your descendants. And this is part of prophecies, one of the prophecies concerning that eventually goes to the Messiah. Because he is giving promises to Abraham, and this nation, this multiplying, I will multiply your descendants. Well, one of his descendants happens to be the Messiah. Now, these are called, here are these two immutable things. Verse 18, we're chapter 6, verse 18, that by two immutable things, these are unalterable things. What are the two things? The promise and the oath. Those are the things that cannot, will not change, and they didn't change. They proved true. All right, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation, that's encouragement and comfort, who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. Now, verse 19, this hope we have an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, in which enters the presence behind the veil. Now, we stopped right there, and we spoke briefly last week that the audience, the primary audience, those that were reading this for the first time, knew their Old Testament very well. And of course, each Bible book goes on with the assumption, we could say with the assumption, you've already read everything before it, with the assumption that you have. Even Matthew chapter 1 begins with the words, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. All right, who's David, who's Abraham? It assumes you already know that because those already existed. Those have existed for a long, long time. And the prophecies concerning the son of Abraham, also the son of David. This is, they knew the Old Testament well because he mentions that of which enters the presence behind the veil. Now, if you don't know the Old Testament, you have no idea what that means. What veil are we talking about? What is that? Well, it was the veil that separated the regular part of the temple where all the priests do their work inside the temple from the holiest of all, or also known as the Holy of Holies. There's a veil right there, and it's a separate chamber or separate room. Inside it is the Ark of the Covenant, and not anybody could just go in there. Not anybody, matter of fact, no one could go in there except the high priest, and him only once a year. Now, the only time someone else did was prior to the temple, when it was the Kohathites, it's the family inside the Levites. The Kohathites would have, when they were packing up the tabernacle, they would have to do that. And they were authorized to do that. But otherwise, in the temple doesn't move. And there is the veil there, and no one goes in there except the high priest. Nobody. And here I want to look at verse 19 from the beginning. This hope we have as an anchor for the soul. These two immutable things, the promises of God and the fact that He has taken an oath concerning this. It is an anchor for the soul, and the soul needs an anchor. A person needs an anchor. A person can't just drift about and really be the best they could be. And they're gonna hit the storms without an anchor, and you've got a problem. Now, here's the thing with anchors and ships. When a ship is off of a coastline, it drops anchor. All right, and that is, of course, they're going to take boats and go on to shore. The ship is off the coast, and it puts down anchor. And it puts down anchor not just because there might be a storm, but that it's on the water, and it wouldn't take too much wind or too big of waves to where in time the ship will be drifting toward the shore, away from shore, down the shoreline. It's going to drift. It's going to naturally drift. It may be slow or it may be fast, but it will. And come a storm, it's definitely going to happen. Now, we put that to the soul, needing an anchor. That a soul can, that is a person, can drift. And they can drift what we could say in the most pleasant of times. They can drift. Matter of fact, people can drift right comfortably and quite comfortably into the worst of situations because they have no anchor. But when there's a storm, they are entirely helpless. And there's no anchor. There's nothing there. And people will just find the world as being a place that is bleak, a place that is horrible, a place where there is no hope, a place where the only way to get through this is not to get through it, just commit suicide. And there's no anchor to help them through that. But here, and I'm not saying everybody that gets into the storms of life becomes suicidal, but obviously some do. But in the storms of life, having an anchor to the soul is an extremely positive thing. And here, the writer says there is an anchor for the soul. And it's going to be based on faith. Faith on God's promises, that He's going to keep His promises. And He is showing us that God, in fact, kept that promise to Abraham. He kept it. And it was going to take a long time to fulfill. And God didn't tell Abraham that it was going to be fulfilled in his lifetime or going to be fulfilled next month. It was going to take a while. And it did take a while in the timeline of God. And it was done precisely on time, precisely on cue, precisely as God had always intended it. And Abraham knew it couldn't be in his lifetime. He knew that it couldn't be. That he would be gone, and could take who knows how many years to fulfill. But here is this anchor that's sure and steadfast. It holds the one who has faith in God, the Christian. It holds, the faithful Christian, holds that one steady in whatever the situations of life bring. It holds that one steady. And there is hope that is given by God. And there is a value in this. There's a value in the lessons that are being given. And there's a value in the biblical text to where one can have a more stable self even when everything around them is unstable rather. Everything around them is a whirlwind. They can be a stable factor in it. And I have personally known families where inside that family there might have been 2 members of the church, and everyone else in that family, life was just this chaotic mess. And they recognized that, these two, this daughter and son-in-law, or this son and daughter-in-law, that they are the most stable people and the most steady people in the family. They recognized it. Even when they would have nothing to do with Christ, they recognized it, and they also knew why it was the case. They also knew. And when things were really going bad, they would rely on them because they knew, they're not the source of the trouble. They're the source of something stable and steady. Now, we come back to these words, which enters the presence behind the veil. Our hope is there. Our Savior and High Priest is there behind that veil. Now, verse 20, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, this is for the sake of it, the 7th time he's been called a high priest, and the 3rd time he has mentioned Psalm 110:4, though he hasn't completely quoted it yet. High priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, here we are ending chapter 6, about to go into chapter 7. In chapter 5, verse 11, he made mention that there's more to say concerning Melchizedek, but they are kind of on the drowsy side, that they were dull of hearing. And after this section of talking about how they should have grown spiritually, the things that they have been doing, things that they have not been doing, and also concerning this promise that was given in the past, now he's going to begin to explain what is meant by a priest, high priest forever according to Melchizedek. Now, obviously, this is assigned to Christ. It's nobody else. It's assigned to Christ. Christ is under the order of Melchizedek. He's a high priest under that order. And now, chapter 7, let's just begin, and then we'll need to go to Genesis chapter 14. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, blessed him. Now, let's go to Genesis 14. Because very little is said about him. There is nothing said about him before chapter 14. There's nothing said, as we already made mention, there's nothing said about him until we get to Psalm 110:4. And then, once again, nothing said until we get to the book of Hebrews. So it's this, and the Bible does this all over the place. All over the place, of where something may be mentioned here, and we learn a little bit more about it over here. It doesn't contradict, it's just added knowledge. And writers do it all the time. Okay? Writers do it all the time, of where they give a little bit of information here, then on down the line give a little bit of information here. And now, writers may have a different reason for why God did it. But He is showing that this is a unified book. He is showing that. He's also proving this book is a book to be studied, not to be sped read. It is to be studied, and you will never, ever get everything you need about a subject from one place, from one verse, from one chapter, from one book. Never. It all works together. And so, in chapter 14, Genesis chapter 14, we have the first war or battle that is recorded in the Bible. That doesn't mean it's the first ever in history, because I think there were a lot prior to the flood. It talks of violence and bloodshed before the flood. I think there were a lot of wars in those ancient days. But here we have this war that goes on, and it's 5 kings against 4 kings. A lot of nations involved in this, okay? Even though some of these aren't going to be terribly big. They're like the Kingdom of Sodom. Kingdom of Sodom could not have been very big. You could think of it like a city-state, but it still had its king. And now you have those kings that come from the east. You have Chedorlaomer, and you have all these others that are coming in the 14th year. I'm looking at verse 5. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked. Okay, and those kings are listed in verse 1. It came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, entitled king of nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shimber, king of Zeboam, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Okay, so those that came from the east conquered Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboam, Zoar. They conquered them. And among them is Abraham's nephew and his family. Abraham's nephew. And Abraham goes to rescue them. He has his own private army. When needed. I don't think they're always an army. Matter of fact, I'm quite sure they're not. But he goes with his own men and he rescues them. So he beats Chedorlaomer and company. He beats them and he rescues all of these nations. He rescued Sodom. He rescued Admah and Gomorrah and Zeboam and Zoar. He rescued them. Now, as let's go to verse 16. So he brought back all the goods and also brought back his brother Lot, that actually his nephew, but his kinsman, and his goods, as well as the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is, the king's valley. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Now, verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem. Where is Salem? Salem is not Sodom or any of these other cities. Salem is the very ancient name of Jerusalem. King of Salem. So Melchizedek, king of Salem. Just here it is out of nowhere. But, I mean, that's what Genesis has already been doing. Chapter 14, who heard of these other kings and these other places? But now we have Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of the God Most High. Now, it makes this definitely known that this is not a priest of some pagan god, not a priest of some form of Baal or a priest of whomever. He is a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." Now, who was possessor of heaven and earth? That's God Most High. "And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." And he, that's Abraham, and he gave him a tithe of all. So all the goods that Abraham managed to get actually had been offered to Abraham. Abraham refused to take it, as it would be like the reward. But Abraham refused to take it. But he's giving a tenth of all this to Melchizedek. Okay. Now we hear nothing else about Melchizedek. Things continue on in the life of all these people. And we continue on concerning Abram. And he's going to be given the name Abraham. And his wife's going to be given the name Sarah. And this is this figure that his name is only mentioned once here in Genesis. And we only have 3 verses, verses 18, 19, 20, and that's it. No more. But we see that he is priest of God Most High, and Moses is writing this down. It is, obviously, he's getting it from the Holy Spirit. And so this is a legitimate priest in those days who cannot be of the Levitical priesthood because Levi hasn't even been born. And the fact is, Levi will never be a priest. It's going to be until we get to Aaron and his sons, which are generations after Levi. So this is a priesthood that outdates the Levitical priesthood by centuries at least. It's a priesthood that was around long before the Levitical priesthood, before we get to Moses and the law of Moses being handed down. Now that we have that, let's go back to the book of Hebrews. We go back to Hebrews chapter 7. Yes.
He was a priesthood of patriarchal.
Yes, he would have to be.
Okay, and the head of the household was the one who made the sacrifice.
Yes. Okay. Now, here is the question for those viewing the video. This would be on Melchizedek would be under patriarchy. That is correct. That is the only law that existed, and it's from God, that existed prior to Mount Sinai, whereas there's a separation between Jew and Gentile. Now, the Jews were under the law of Moses. Gentiles continue to be under the law of patriarchy. They weren't called to be under the law of Moses. Ruth and others, Rahab, they volunteered. They were willing to do that, but they didn't have to do that. They could very well worship God under the laws of patriarchy. Was Melchizedek under patriarchy? Yes, he was. The heads of the households were the ones to make sacrifices to God. Yes, of where we see, when a man becomes a certain age, he is to do his own sacrifices, like we see Cain and Abel doing. Okay. Now, does that make them priests? It does not make them priests. But here is, because they're not called that, but here is one, Melchizedek, who is called that. And he has an order, and God has formed, is legitimate. God has formed that order. One could call the Levitical priesthood the order of Levi. You could do that. This is a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek. And it is similar to Melchizedek. It has the authority that Melchizedek had, and it is far greater than the Levitical priesthood. Far greater, as he is going to make mention. Now, Melchizedek, as the text is going to explain, he could not trace his genealogy to Aaron, because Aaron won't be around for many, many centuries. But he's legitimately priest of God Most High. And this is in the days of patriarchy, and now Christ being under the order of Melchizedek, or according to the order of Melchizedek, does not put him back into patriarchy at all. All that's been nailed to the cross, but he has he is greater than this priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood, because he's a high priest forever, and he happens to be the Son of God. Now, we come to this. Let's just read verse 1. So Hebrews 7, verse 1 again. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated, this is Melchizedek, king of righteousness, then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. And this is describing Jesus now. Yeah, as Melchizedek was king of righteousness, so too is Jesus king of righteousness. As he was the king of Salem, that means king of peace, so too Jesus is the king of priests, king of peace, rather. Now, he's also king of priests. Now that I said that, yeah, we're kings and priests. We reign with him as priests. But verse 3, this priesthood is not tied to a family at all. Without father, now this is describing both Melchizedek and Jesus in this way. Without father, without mother, without genealogy. That's what it means. Okay? It doesn't mean that Jesus had no mother. We know that he did. It doesn't mean that Melchizedek had no mother. He had to, unless he was miraculously put on the earth, which it doesn't say that he was. But all this comes down to without genealogy, which means that it's not based on, this priesthood is not based on what tribe you're in. It's not based on that. Levitical priesthood was. And he's going to make mention of that Jesus could not be a priest under the old covenant because he's not from Levi, he's from Judah. But this is speaking of that Melchizedek, it didn't matter who his mother was, it didn't matter who his father was, it didn't matter who his genealogy was. He's still a priest. So without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, that is Jesus, not beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains priest continually. because he's a priest, high priest, forever. Forever. So he is a priest continually. Now, verse 4. Now consider how great this man was. We're talking about Melchizedek, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. So this is also, and we made mention of this last week, this is inferring from the message of what would be an implied message. It would be an implied message. And someone reading Genesis chapter 14 might not quite gather all of this, but I think you could well understand it if it were introduced to you, that obviously Melchizedek is someone important because Abraham respects him as something important, and he is a priest of the Most High God. That's what it says. And Abraham gives him a tenth of the spoils when Abraham wouldn't take any of it. Okay? This shows that he is someone important, and the Hebrews writer is going to show us that obviously Melchizedek is of a greater position than Abraham is. Now consider, verse 4, now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law. That is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. So, he's saying, Levitical priesthood, they receive tithes. They receive a tenth from the people. They receive that because they are acting as priests. And the people recognize that, and by law, they are to give a tenth of whatever they earn to the it actually goes to the priests and to the temple so that all of that can continue. The temple can be maintained and the priesthood can be maintained. Okay? Though all of this and now Levi, who we've already said Levi was never a priest, but Levi is the great-grandson of Abraham. And when we get to Aaron, who's going to be the first high priest, and then his sons, who are going to be the first priests, Nadab and Abihu were just two of those. I don't know how many generations that is. It's quite a period of time there. Now, he's saying that this Levitical priesthood receives tithes from the people, but, verse 6, but he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. So this predates all of that. Genesis 14 predates all of that, of where their ancestor Abraham, who they would recognize as being an important figure. Is Abraham of less importance than Levi? No, we wouldn't say that. And Abraham is giving tithes to Melchizedek, showing that Melchizedek is of greater importance than Levi or Aaron or the Levitical priesthood. Verse 7, now beyond all contradiction, aside from the tithe, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Did Abraham bless Melchizedek? No. Melchizedek blessed him. Melchizedek is the one who did that. Abraham, what's verse 7 saying? Abraham is the lesser and Melchizedek is the better. Melchizedek is the better in all this because the lesser is blessed by the better. Here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives. So here we have mortal men They receive tithes, but there is an immortal. There is someone who is eternal. There's someone that death has nothing on Christ. Christ is eternal, and he will be eternally a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, because that is what was sworn by Jehovah. Psalm 110:4. That's precisely what he swore. And now, mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom, look at this, it is witnessed that he lives. That is Christ. Were there witnesses that Christ lived? Yeah. That he resurrected? Yeah. Yep. There were witnesses to that. There were witnesses to him ascending into heaven. There were witnesses to that. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have Paul writing to the church at Corinth concerning the fact that some were saying there in Corinth that there was no resurrection. The resurrection is fiction. Okay? And that would be the whole subject of resurrection cannot be. And Paul writes that if the resurrection cannot be, then Christ is not resurrected. And there's a lot of problems with that. And the problem would be that all of this is pointless. All of this is useless. We might as well just go live our lives the way we want to live them and forget about Jesus of Nazareth altogether if there is no resurrection. But there is. And he was resurrected. And there were witnesses. It was witnessed that he lives. Now, verse 9, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak. Okay, in a way of saying that Levi paid these tithes because of his great-grandfather paid them before Levi was even born. His great-grandfather gave respect to this man who is better than Abraham. And is Levi greater than his great-grandfather? No, he's not. Not at all. And that Abraham paid these tithes, and so to speak, Levi paid them as well. How's that? Verse 10, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him, when Melchizedek met Abraham. Verse 11, therefore, if perfection, here is the conclusion, therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? And this is the fourth time he's mentioned this order of Melchizedek, those words, order of Melchizedek. And he says clearly, if that Levitical priesthood was all that needed to be, there would not need to be another one. Now understand that the other one, the order of Melchizedek, was prophesied in Psalm 110:4. It's not just suddenly sprung upon us in the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament. In the style of the Holy Spirit, he has already spoken of these things many centuries before they're going to be addressed more fully and fulfilled. Many years are going to pass. So that some critic may say, okay, this is all nonsensical because the New Testament writers are just making this up because they don't want to be part of the Levitical priesthood. David wrote Psalm 110 centuries, about 900 years before we get to the Christ. And he wrote Psalm 110 then. Okay. And if you would like to see ancient versions of Psalm 110, you may. It can be done. And if you would like to see, just go to the Septuagint. And the Septuagint, 250 BC, 250 BC, has Psalm 110 right there. Now it's been translated into Greek, but obviously it existed. And 250 BC, it wasn't exactly dominated by Christians, was it? Because Christ wouldn't come around for another 250 years. But here is this being spoken of, and this mystery of Psalm 110:4 concerning that order of Melchizedek, this mystery now being shown. That's what that means. We knew it had to do with the Christ. Had to be the Messiah. But what does it mean? Now he's saying it. Here's this enigmatic or this mysterious saying from the past now being made clear. And this is why it had to be done. Because the Levitical priesthood wasn't perfect. Why wasn't it perfect? One, sacrifices were all wrong. Blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. Number two, the high priest and every other priest under the Levitical priesthood, they die. And it changes. You know, you can get the sons of Eli, if you remember that, Hophni and Phinehas, they were corrupt priests. So you can have some good men, and then they die, and you get some other men, and they're not so good. It's an unsteady situation there, the Levitical priesthood. It's an unsteady situation. Even Samuel's sons were wicked priests. But we can also look at Nadab and Abihu. Nadab and Abihu, the first generation of priests, were no good, and their years as being priests pretty brief. That's pretty brief. They die, and they all die under the Levitical priesthood. Eventually, they all die. But under this priesthood, you have a high priest that never dies. He is good, and he is always there. He's always there in a far greater place. If you think where the Ark of the Covenant, if you think that was the Holy of Holies, think of where Christ serves as high priest. Far greater than that. Much, much greater. Now, let's I want to read verse 11 again, and then we need to close it down. Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? Now, he's going to begin to answer that, and we've started that answer. He's going to begin to answer that question in the next 3 verses. And he's also going to be he's been using a lot of implication, a lot of implied messages, a lot of inference. He's been using a lot of reason and putting this all together, showing this is how it's done. This is how it's done, and it can be done. And if we understand that what God said in a particular book is true, then we can take it and we can reason from it. If we know that everything He has written throughout the Bible is true, it says it is. I believe it is. You can make your own decision. But if we believe it's true, then we can put all this together and make logical conclusions. Logical conclusions on many, many things. Not just what the Hebrews writer is doing at the moment concerning the priesthood, but on many, many things. And want to thank everybody being with us. We'll continue next week. And just thank you, everybody.